Here's a short reading from Carl Jung from his book Ion in a chapter called The Shadow. The archetypes most clearly characterized from the empirical point of view are those which have the most frequent and most disturbing influence on the ego. These are the shadow, the anima, and the animus. The most accessible of these and the easiest to experience is the shadow, for its nature can in large measure be inferred from the contents of the personal unconscious. The only exceptions to this rule are those rather rare cases where the positive qualities of the personality are repressed, and the ego, in consequence, plays an essentially negative or unfavorable role. There's a lot in that little sentence here, a couple of sentences, but here we have Jung laying out a little vision for how the psyche works and how repressed or unknown content floats beneath the ego, that's the image I'd like to use, and occasionally arises and disturbs it. And my main interest today is to have a little conversation about the shadow, which he calls the easiest of these to integrate. The animus and the anima, these are the masculine and feminine domains of the psyche, are deeper and are more archetypal than the personal shadow here. I'll just read a little more to give you a flavor here. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. I love this because people say, oh yeah, I've done my shadow work, which is the ego responding and checking a box saying, nothing to see here. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. And if I back up for a moment, sometimes it's not just the dark aspects, but what he calls the positive qualities of the personality. Both can be in the shadow. That's in the previous paragraph. This act of recognizing the dark aspects of the personality, this act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Indeed, self-knowledge as a psychotherapeutic measure frequently requires much painstaking work extending over a long period. So I want to talk about today the shadow and the soul. I want to talk a little bit about, quote, shadow work, which is now kind of in the spiritual-ish sort of milieu, culture, Instagram, retreats, programs. I'm offering a program on the shadow and the soul coming up in a couple weeks. There are actually still some spots available. You can go to my website for the details, send me an email. It's here in Michigan. And that's fairly new. I mean, Carl Jung is the one that, I was about to say invented the shadow, named something that, of course, saints, mystics, spiritual traditions, religious traditions have named in their own way, but he named it in a modern sense, called it the shadow. So we owe the origins of our modern psychological understanding of the shadow to Jung. But even 10, 15 years ago, I didn't hear anyone talking like this, really. And all of a sudden, it's kind of like here. And that's, I think, good. I think there's an opportunity here. You know, I can pick on it a little bit because I get to hear people saying things like, occasionally, I've done my shadow work, or come to a workshop and integrate your shadow. And one of the first things he says in the opening chapter here on the shadow is that it's painstaking, It requires considerable moral effort, and it has to be done over a long period of time. Because the stuff that's hidden in there doesn't want to come out of hiding. It doesn't work that way. You can't go into the woods with a gun and a flashlight and force out all this unconscious material. It simply will resist you at all cost and typically make things worse. So the first thing I want to say is shadow work is slow and painstaking and requires a little bit of humor and a little bit of lightness, and there's no rush here. So at best we could say, and maybe here, this, if you've listened to my podcast before, I've talked about the shadow several times. I like what Robert Bly says about it. He says it's like dining at a table. You only take little bites at a time, and it's more like that. And if you try to, wolf down an entire meal, it's not going to go well. It's a little bite here and a little bite there, especially if it's going to be metabolized. If it's going to be, fancy word, integrated. Although I don't really love that word. I like metabolized. Carl Jung would just say made conscious. So that's where we're going today. A little podcast on the shadow and the soul. And I kind of have three domains here. I want to talk again about a map of the psyche. I want to give you a little image of the psyche itself, one way of imagining it. Then I want to talk about what is projection, because without projection, we really wouldn't have any knowledge of our unconscious material. So it's a gift. And then I want to talk about myth, why we need myth and fairy tale to have a relationship with our unconscious material, with the unknown, particularly with the shadow. Myths are filled with shadow material, and they were the ancient way of coming into relationship with these hidden and unknown parts. And with the larger archetypal parts, which are not personal. I'm not going to get so much into that because, I'll just repeat again what Jung says. The easiest is the personal unconscious material, which he calls the shadow. The much more difficult aspects of shadowy material are the anima and the animus. These are archetypal constellations of masculine and feminine energies, and those are not personal. If you hear people say, I've integrated my anima or my animus, I don't know if people really say that, but I've done my work and I have integrated my masculine or feminine side, the contra-sexual dimension of my psyche. That's kind of laughable because it's not personal. We can come into relationship with the larger archetypal patterns of masculine and feminine. We can come into more healthy relationship, but they're simply beyond the personal. We always stand sort of in awe and in humility between these larger archetypal forces. In the old world, those were called the gods. You don't integrate a god. You just come into relationship with it. Okay. So a map of the psyche, what is projection, and why we need myth and all this. And I'll read a couple passages straight from Jung, which I think is important. Okay, so let's begin with an image or a map of the psyche itself. And the place to begin, I think, is with the ego. And when I say ego, what I mean is the conscious self. This is the I in any sentence. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I think this, I feel that. That's the ego. You can't get rid of it even if you tried. You can have experiences of transcending the small I, but the ego is like the seat or the center of your personality and of your conscious personality. But that ego is like a tiny island on a vast ocean. And the ocean itself is the whole psyche, the totality. You could even say whatever is real. I would say God, reality, the totality. The ego, our tiny little ego, is an island on the vast sea. Most of the time, in a pretty immature ego, we're not even aware that we're on an island. It's like we look around and say, this is it. There's nothing else. There's just me and my world and my relationships and the way I see things and what I think is important, what I feel. The phrase, I just think, I just feel, very egocentric, and not a lot of awareness that beyond the borders here is a vast ocean of unconscious material, of what I don't know anything about. And another kind of like analogous metaphor is the human body. We say, I'm up to this and I'm up to that, but the vast majority of our organic and biological processes, we have no say in. The ego, the conscious self, has no say in. Our heartbeat, our breath, the way our blood is moving through the body, everything, almost everything. You could think about that as 99% of your experience of your experience of being human. The ego has very little control, very little say, and very little knowledge of. So it makes sense. Okay, so that's the place to start. Now, on the island is a little castle. This is purely from my imagination here. Is a little castle, and it's kind of the center of our ego island, and that I would call the persona. Persona means mask. It's how you appear from the outside. And we all have a persona. It's like when you go to work, people say, bring your whole self to work. Actually, you're just bringing your persona, the mask you're wearing. Many people don't even know they're wearing a mask, and they call that their whole self. No, it's just a mask. And we all have them. And this feeling of being slightly different in different situations in rooms. So the mask is a little bit flexible or malleable, but that's your persona. That's how people perceive you and how you perceive the world. And you need that. It's an interface between the larger world and the ego itself. So that's your persona, and that's a little castle on the island. Now, out on the borders, the edge of the island, where the sand and the sea touch, just wading out a little bit, I would call the shadow. This is out beyond the solid ground of the I, of who I think I am, and out into the deeper waters a little bit. This would be the personal shadow. This is where it's still part of the island. That's what's interesting. It's still connected to the landmass, but we just can't see it. That's the shadow. And really, I don't want to try to I'm not really speaking for Jung. I'm sort of telling you how I read these things. You could say anything that's in the unconscious is shadow or shadowy, because again, if you take the image of facing the sun, you're looking at the sun rising in the east here, and it's a beautiful sunrise, but behind you is the shadow and you can't see it. So anything you can't see is shadowy. And sometimes those are impulses, instincts, emotions, fears. A lot of them have highly emotional charges, but it could also be traumas and wounds that we don't know very much about. Could be experiences that have been repressed or forgotten. All of that would be shadow material. And the reason why it goes into the shadow, the reason why it's out, in the waters, is because when it's hidden, the ego can carry on. And we need that. I don't think any of us could survive the war of childhood without certain things going into the shadow. I don't care what your parents were like, what your environment was like, what kind of religious or non-religious background you had, your wounds, your traumas, your fears, your experiences, the full frontal assault of those on a developing ego is too much. It will destroy us. We won't survive. So bits and pieces of our experience get pushed out into the waters there. And all we're doing, and all from the ego's point of view, we look out at the beautiful sunset. There it is in the beautiful waters. And we're not really aware of what's beneath the surface until we're ready. And I think this is one of the amazing things about the human psyche, about reality, about psychological and spiritual growth, is there seems to be a deep, deep impulse. I would call this God drawing us to God. That's a theological way of putting it. Jungians might say the self wants to grow and mature, wants to become more whole, wants to be more unified. And when we're ready enough, that kind of shadowy material begins to arise. And sometimes most of the time we don't like it, because it seems like an affront to the island, especially to the persona, to the castle. Not in this chapter, in, I think, The Undiscovered Self, another Jungian book, he says the shadow is the opposite of the persona. That's, I think, a simple way of putting it. And I'll give you an example from my own life. I think I've used it on this podcast. At least I put it in a sermon or two. But I used to have a sticker on my truck, my 1994 Ford Ranger, stick shift 4-cylinder with a pinstripe, sweet truck, had towing mirrors, which is funny, you couldn't tow anything. And I had a sticker on it that said, "Are you kind?" It's a little Grateful Dead reference, a little bit of a druggy reference. But at the time, I had this persona. I was like cool and kind and, just go with the flow. But anyone who got to know me or anyone in my closer circles would have told you Kent is angry and can be mean. I would deny it outright. I mean, there's just no way I could see that. And that's a little bit of my own personal relationship with anger in the shadow. And so I'm pumping up my persona that I'm the opposite. So the opposite of "Are you kind?" was just my sort of angry, aggressive, bitter, and resentful self. But it's out there in the waters, and I can't see it. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it for many, many years. Okay, and just to complete the image here, really cursory image of the map of the psyche, out into deeper waters, the deep, deep waters, is the anima and the animus, and where all the archetypes live. And archetypes are transpersonal. They're not ours. It's not my anima, my animus. It's more like the anima, the masculine, the deep masculine, or the deep feminine. Anima is feminine, animus is masculine. Transcend and include the personal. Okay, I have my own constellation, my own, to quote James Hollis, magical other. That's a constellation of the anima. The feminine appears to me in certain images, but it's not, but it's just an image. The energies go deep into the sea, deep into what's real. I mean, even cottonwood trees. There are even male and female cottonwood trees. So how deep is the anima and the animus? Well, it's pretty deep. So I can only come into slightly more conscious relationship with it over time. And excuse me. And what else is the sea? The totality? That's God. That's reality with a capital R. I love Evelyn Underhill's image for God. She just capitalizes reality. The totality of existence itself, and which includes the persona and the ego and the shadow and the animus and the anima. That's God, and we're in God. That's why I think the Christian mystics, like Merton, say when we touch the true self, we touch God. So the deeper we go into what's really, really true for us, the more it expands out, like an hourglass that comes in and then back out again into all of what's real, into God. Okay. Just to answer the question, why would we even mess with shadow material? Well, because you and I exist as a kind of series of potentials, you could say. And for some reason, just like the whole universe moves from simple to complex, that's what it's like to grow up psychologically and spiritually. We're on a path. You could even say we're evolving, although we can be arrested in our development at any stage or phase. But there's something deep in life itself that moves from simple to complex. And so when you and I move from simple to complex, we need our shadowy material to come out of the shallow waters and onto the island. And we become more whole, to use a common phrase. It's a phrase from Jung. He talks about wholeness. Wholeness is not perfection. It's just more of what's real becoming conscious. And that lives as a kind of potential. I mean, a person that has access to deep thinking, a deep sense of feeling, which is associated with values, is in tune with their senses, can really see and sense and taste the world, and has a very active imagination and intuition. Those are the four facets: thinking, sensing, feeling, and intuition. Is, I was going to say, more whole. I just used air quotes, but that's true. It's like, I don't want to say more rounded because it makes it sound like it's about balance, and I don't think that's quite it, but more of our potentials of a deeply full and satisfying life have come online, to borrow a computer metaphor, okay? Are available and being used. And that's good, and we want that. And that means we're well on the way to growing up. And why would we want to grow up? Because we need elders. We need a healthier world. And this is a bias of all spiritual work, that the real work has to happen internally and personally. If you want a better world, if you want to quit pointing the finger that everybody else is the problem. We're now in a season of political ads. I was just watching some YouTube and I'm getting political ads, and one of them was so blatant. It's like, I didn't even want to get into who's running and all that stuff. These are local elections, but it's like, so-and-so is the problem. And thankfully, this person is the solution. You know, this kind of like black and white. But if you want to change the world, you have to start internally and personally. You have to start with the personal stuff. You have to say, I am also what I despise. And then you're well on the way. That's not to minimize, doing, social work, changing laws and politicians and working in your community. I'm not against that. But when it comes to psychological and spiritual growth, as Jesus says, take the plank out of your own eye. That's the place to start. And one more piece here. Why would we want to become more whole? Well, I'll use Christian language. To become more like God, or to imitate Christ. That more of the mystery of God is incarnated in our world. Something like that. Okay, so how do any of us start with this? How are we supposed to see what we can't see? I mean, is it a matter of, does the ego like say, well, tomorrow I'm going to start? You know, how does it work? And there's a reason why it's hidden, and there's a reason why it's difficult, and there's a reason why it takes a long time. So how do you even start? And the low-hanging fruit here has to do with projection. Every human being projects. We put onto something else what we can't see. Our positive and negative qualities, our positive and negative energies, our capacity for good, our capacity for evil, what we cannot really see, we see in other people first. That's what projection is. And it's slippery, because even if you start to see it, you start to recognize, actually, the thing I hate in my boss, actually, I do that it starts to emerge from the sea. It starts to come into your ego consciousness. And we can immediately sort of say to ourselves, got it, did it, now I see it. But it often just kind of changes form slightly. It can go right back into hiding. So we want to be humble when it comes to the question of projection. And Marie-Louise von Franz says, thank God for projections, otherwise none of this stuff would come out. I should also mention, besides people and objects, we can project onto books, onto movies, onto, of course, famous people and things in the culture. But anything that sort of captures our fascination, interest, and activates us, often in a exaggerated way, is a clue that there's some projection material going on. Like if you take all of your colleagues at work and there's that one person that gets under your skin, almost without exception, you're dealing with some kind of projection. And even if you say that to yourself, doesn't mean you know what it's about. It just means you're kind of on the right track, I'd say. So let me read some Jung here. As we know, this is again from the chapter on the shadow in Ion. As we know, it is not the conscious subject, but the unconscious which does the projecting. So it's not the ego. It's the unconscious material sort of throwing stuff forward into our ego consciousness, the projection. So we're not even aware that we're doing it. That's the simple way of saying it. The effect, and this is maybe the most important part, the effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment. So I am not that. I am other than you. I'm not in relationship. I'm definitely not like you, positive or negative. So isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relationship to it, there is now only an illusory one. Think about this with dating. This is what happens. This is the initial phase of falling in love. It's not a real relationship with a messy human. It's an illusory one. This person is, the greatest ever, my soulmate. I can't get enough of them, everything about them. I just want to be around them all the time. The whole drill. I'll just keep reading. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. And I think this is such a powerful sentence. Projections change the world into the replica of one's unknown face. I think both COVID and the election or elections of Donald Trump have magnified this capacity to change the world into the replica of one's unknown face. So all of a sudden, what we call polarization, in our culture, the right and the left, they both end up massively changing the world into a replica of their unknown face. Both sides accuse the other of lying, and what's tricky is we're not just talking about the masses here, although that's happening. There's this kind of a massive division, right and left, but that split runs right through the human heart, runs through you and I. I don't care what your temperament, personality, political persuasion, politics is, these domains, let's just call it right and left, live in us. Either we're a totality or we're not. Either some dimension of us wants to preserve and conserve, and another dimension wants to expand and move out and progress, or not. But my point is we contain both. We contain multitudes, to quote Walt Whitman. And the more quickly we're able to see that psychologically, spiritually, the easier it is to then interface with the world and to interface with what's real instead of interfacing or relating to an illusion about the world. And that illusion, in its most extreme, divides the world between the righteous and the unrighteous. And it just so happens, I happen to be the righteous one here. I happen to have the right worldview and the right action and the right behavior and the right politics, whereas you, on the other hand, do not. So when that, the iron curtain, the dividing wall of hostility, that's a line from Paul, the dividing wall of hostility in the human heart starts to crumble, and we start to see our own complexities, that I too can lie, and okay, I'll give you some uncomfortable personal examples. This is really true, okay? When Donald Trump was running the first time, for some reason, well, now I know the reason, but every time he said anything, it would like throw my day off. You know, I would like be so activated. And this was pointed out to me by my family, basically, and by some of my friends. Like, I just couldn't let certain things go, particularly the fact that he doesn't tell the truth. Like, what's going on? Like, and sometimes he doesn't even finish his sentences. He sort of just kind of hints at things and doesn't really close the loop. And of course, you can guess where this is going. This is a problem of mine. And I think I mentioned in the last podcast that, to my surprise, right now, at least this time in my life, I'm seeing much more of my tendencies are more are more like the 9 in the Enneagram. And the 9 hides, and the 9 avoids, and the 9 doesn't tell the truth. Okay? Well, I would tell the truth, but I'll massage it slightly. Depending on who's in the room, I'll leave out key details, usually about very minor things. And that, by the way, this is not to say anything about who's got the right or wrong politics or what's best for America or whatever. That's not the point of this podcast. But on the personal level, that kind of activation, I'm completely hooked, and half of my day or half of my week is ruined by a politician, tells you that psychological projection is at work and shadowy material is at work. The more quickly I can say, actually, I am the liar here, then the easier it is to see more clearly. And that's what Jesus says. Take the plank, the massive plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to help your brother or sister with the speck of dust in their eye. What a quotation. I mean, as if Carl Jung invented shadow work, you know. Obviously not. Okay, so far, little map of the psyche, little conversation about projection. And, you know, and maybe here's a place to start with projection. And I sometimes encourage people to do this. People I'm working with one-on-one or sometimes in retreats and programs. But If you make a list of 4 or 5 people, probably not your spouse, but kind of in the next ring out, spouse, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, and maybe even not your parents, but make a list of people that activate you and try to have some on there that are public figures and some that are, you actually know. And write out how you feel in their presence. Like, okay, here's my list, so-and-so. When they speak, when I'm with them, I feel. These could be positive or negative, by the way, when activation. It can be extreme, like I totally everything about this person, or I love, or everything about this person I hate, whatever. Whatever is emotionally overblown, you might say. So make a list of how you feel in their presence, and then make a list of all of the characteristics that you think you see in them, all of them. What are they like? And spell it out and be as plain as day. Then set that aside. And a few days later, come back and take a look at that list and ask yourself calmly, do I ever behave like this? You could ask your significant other, do you think I ever behave like this? And see what they say. Okay. That's a way of it's like putting on, back to my metaphor, you put on a snorkel mask and you go snorkeling out there in the shallow part of the, just beyond the beach here, and you see if you can see anything. Right? So that's a little exercise. All right, so let's talk about myth. I want to read you something, which I think is totally awesome. Let me find it. Okay, here's a little section about why we need myths and fairy tales, particularly when it comes to, I would put biblical material in here too. Although it's not straight myth, it's not fairy tale, but it's kind of a mixture of things. Without the existence, so this is in a chapter, same book, Ion, The Alchemical Interpretation of the Fish. Great chapter title. Okay. Without the existence of conscious concepts, a perception is, as we know, impossible. Okay, I'll translate. Without an image or a concept, even what I'm giving you now, projection is a concept, or my little image of the island and the ego and the castle and the water and the deep waters and so forth. We can't really see it. When unconscious material comes out, we don't have a place to put it. This explains numerous neurotic disturbances which arise from the fact that certain contents are constellated in the unconscious, but cannot be assimilated owing to the lack of apperceptive concepts that would, quote, grasp them. It's like they float up, the material floats up, but we can't, they just slip through our fingers. It's like grabbing air, nothing. That is why it is so extremely important to tell children fairy tales and legends, and to inculcate religious ideas, dogmas, into grown-ups, because these things are instrumental symbols with whose help unconscious contents can be canalized into consciousness, interpreted and integrated. That is an incredible sentence. This sentence is in part why I'm back in the church, why I care about religious material, why I can't leave the Bible alone. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, there's personal stuff too for me, but why I love myths, fairy tales, biblical stories, history, ancient material, the saints and mystics, because they contain symbols whose help unconscious contents can be canalized into consciousness, interpreted, and integrated. Here's a little more. Failing this, their energy flows off into conscious contents which normally are not much emphasized and intensifies them into pathological proportions. Again, Jung is not one of those readers that makes things easy. Like I have to be in a certain mood. But what he's saying is without stories, then our unconscious material becomes pathological. They turn into neuroses and symptoms and pathologies and fixations and psychic disturbances. And I could go on and on. That's a scary prospect. I mean, he's basically saying the lack of real archetypally rich stories explains the situation we're in, why so many of us are psychologically unhealthy, spiritually unhealthy. Who is it? James Hillman says 100 years of psychotherapy and we're sicker than ever. Okay. And I just want to say it in my own words. We need stories because they work better than psychological concepts. Even concepts like the shadow. We still need a story. We need an image. We need a symbol. Because symbols have a kind of resonant quality. They're never fully grasped. They draw us towards something and not just explain something. When people say, I have ADHD, PTSD, and now people have like 1,000 billion, categories. Sometimes even knowing that isn't all that helpful. It's just a category, a categorization of behavior pattern. But there's no way to use Jung's language, interpret and integrate, because there's no story. I'll finish the paragraph. When we then get apparently groundless phobias and obsessions, crazes, idiosyncrasies, hypochondriac ideas, and intellectual perversions suitably camouflaged in social, religious, and political garb. Holy crap. All right, I don't have, I don't want to spend all my time just sort of reflecting on these few sentences from Jung, but you get the general gist here. So instead, I want to turn to some fairy tales and stories. I'm going to do two here. One, you may be kind of familiar with some words in here, but maybe most of you aren't familiar with the myth itself. This is the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. I'm going to give you a real short version of this. Then I want to tug on a couple of biblical stories so you can sort of get the sense that the Bible too plays in this kind of shadowy realm. So the classic myth here of the shadow is Theseus and the Minotaur. Okay, so the story begins with the king, Minos of Crete, the island. So Minos prays to Poseidon. He's the sea god for a sign that he's the true king. And Poseidon responds by sending him a white bull that rises up out of the sea. And the idea was that this beautiful and magnificent beast ought to be sacrificed back to the gods, back to Poseidon. But instead, Minos kind of fell in love with the bull. So he fell in love with the image here, with the beauty of it. I'm interpreting, it's kind of like he gets a little greedy, maybe we would call it inflation, gets a little too into himself, and I don't need to sacrifice this. I'll take this for myself. This is also, you get hints of this in the Cain and Abel story, where Abel offers the best of the flock to God, this kind of thing. And it's implied that Cain doesn't. He kind of keeps for himself the best and doesn't really offer up what he ought to offer up. So anyway, of course, then things go terribly wrong. He keeps the bull for himself and offers a different one as a substitute. So as a kind of punishment, Poseidon causes Minos' wife to become consumed with desire for the bull. And they end up having a baby. And from that union, we get the Minotaur. And the Minotaur is half human, half man, and half bull, and completely monstrous. It's like, so the king gets it wrong, doesn't sacrifice, doesn't do the right thing, and thus a child is born, and this child is a monster, okay? And half bull, half man, filled with passion and dangerous. So this, I hesitate to give too many psychological interpretations, but this kind of instinctual craving, appetite, bull-like energy, animal force, it's cut off from humanity, that sort of thing. And Minos is of course ashamed of this union and of this beast. So he hides it. He orders an inventor to build a labyrinth beneath the palace. This is where the image of the labyrinth comes from. It's not a maze. That's what's important. It's confusing. It's circular. It's kind of goes all over the place. If you've ever walked a labyrinth, it's like you start to get to the center, and then all of a sudden you're moving back out, and you get to the center, and you're moving back out, and of course people use it as a walking prayer, as a meditation today. But in the myth, in the story, it's supposed to be impossible to navigate. And the Minotaur is placed in the center. And here's where we're getting closer to the shadow material. So what we don't want to admit, our own mixed nature, our own animal likeness, what we're trying to send away, is hidden out there in the labyrinth, in the unconscious, in the maze of the unconscious, in the deep waters, we could say. And right in the center is the thing we don't want to look at. Half man, half bull. We'd rather keep it hidden away because we're afraid it's gonna ruin everything. It's gonna consume our life. It's like, back to my story, if I were to let it out that I'm actually angry, I'm afraid that it'll burn the house down. I'll ruin relationships. I'll get into a fight. I don't know what. There's not much conscious thought involved, but it's more like I won't be able to keep up my ego and my persona if I let this back into my life. So I keep it hidden in the labyrinth, far from anything. So now, this is a very long myth, by the way, but they get into a war. I think with Athens, I can't remember, and the Athenians lose the war, and so the Athenians have to, as punishment, send sacrificial young men and women into the labyrinth. It's horrible. It's like there's so many layers of meaning here, but one is that when society goes sideways here, when the king goes sideways and can't admit his own shadow, and when your inner king or queen goes sideways and can't admit their own shadow, all of the innocence and youth gets sacrificed. All of that fresh creativity, the next generation suffers, you could say, socially. On the interpersonal level, it's more like our own youth, creativity, generativity, we're just sending it into the labyrinth to be consumed. So anyway, this is what the Athenians do. They start sending these young people in. So then you have the arrival of a man named Theseus. Okay, so Theseus decides he's going to go and find out what's at the center of the labyrinth. He's going to confront the Minotaur. He's more like the hero figure in the story. And this is a very important move, because as long as the palace is functional enough, with the labyrinth beneath and the Minotaur, as long as they keep sending young people down there, there's a kind of equilibrium. It's terrible, but there's an equilibrium. But something has to come in and disrupt that process. This is what we would, not to make it too simple here, but this is like the beginning of any kind of shadow work or individuation, or there has to be a break from the status quo, and you have to say, I want to look at what I don't want to look at. Or something so awful happens in your life, you make a huge mistake, someone leaves you, you get fired, all of a sudden you have that opportunity. That's Theseus arriving, saying, well, let's look in here. How did I ever get into this situation in the first place? So into the labyrinth he goes. And I I think it's Minos's daughter who makes him the thread, the special and sacred thread. She says, okay, you're going to get lost in the labyrinth, but I'm going to make you some yarn. And maybe she gives him another object too, but into the labyrinth he goes with the yarn so he can find his way back, which is so beautiful. It's so amazing. And this is extremely important because any of this kind of work necessitates that you find your way out of the labyrinth. Anytime you look at unconscious material, do real deep work, you need help. You can't actually do it on your own. You need divine help, and you need guides and mentors and therapists and friends and a structure, usually a religious orientation. That's actually what Jung says, to find your way out of the labyrinth. Because if you do it from a place of ego inflation, I can go into the labyrinth, I can do this, I can do my shadow work. I think about the psychedelics right now. I can look at the enormity of archetypal material on a weekend, ayahuasca journey. That's entering the labyrinth. If you don't have a thread, you're likely to not understand what's happening anyway, but just get lost in the labyrinth. All of the pathways and feelings and dead ends and corners and turns and perhaps not come out. Okay, so you need a thread. As the story goes, he finally reaches the center and confronts the Minotaur. And there are actually different versions of this story, but one night they get into like a battle. One that's a kind of wrestling match. I like the wrestling match because it reminds me of the Jacob wrestling the angel story. It's not the angel. I'll come back to that in a second. There's some kind of struggle, which, of course, is an image for what this work is like. That's why I wanted to begin with it's slow, it's hard, it's difficult, and we're resistant to it because we have to wrestle with what we don't want to wrestle with. We'd rather stay in a place of denial, moral superiority, instead of humility. Or we'd rather project all of that onto our enemies. Okay, all of what we don't like onto our enemies or onto our heroes, if we want to put it in the sort of golden projections. Darkness is part of my nature. Deep darkness is part of my nature. It's in me. I have those capacities. It's part of me. That's wrestling the Minotaur. It's looking in the mirror and actually not liking what you see. This is why most people don't want to do it. All people don't want to do it, really. But it requires a wrestling, and who knows how long that wrestling is. But you have to get in there and get your hands dirty a bit. But you can't stay there. That's what the thread is for. So anyway, he ends up defeating the beast and returning. Now you could ask, what does the beast represent? Well, many things. We could just simply say the shadow, shadowy material. And really instinctual shadowy material, aggression, sexuality, hunger, greed, ambition, the 7 deadly sins, rage, vitality, sensuality, sexuality, animal energy. These are the big ones that might be in the shadowy domain. It could also be our gifts, our creativity, our genius, so to speak, that spark of wild, unique offering to the world. All of that could be in the shadow, down there in the Minotaur, half human, half bull. You get the idea. The labyrinth itself kind of represents the complex 2 steps forward, 1 step back pathway to some of this more hidden material. And to sink into the labyrinth, to go beneath the palace, back to my, to the image here, but also back to my original island. And we're going to go under the palace into the labyrinth. That often looks like depression and confusion and, disorientation, a midlife crisis, any kind of loss of meaning, even an addiction. And I think we live in a highly addictive society. That's the labyrinth. So you need the thread. Okay. Now, First of all, I hope you enjoyed the story, but you see how the story itself, the myth, gives us images which help us relate to how this process works, rather than just using concepts. It's a story. Do you know the feeling of slipping into the labyrinth? Do you know the feeling of not wanting to sacrifice? You could take any of these images that arise, because it's not always a linear story, obviously, but any of these images here, and ask, what's my relationship with these? Do I know anything about this? Have I had a taste of this? Some of the, maybe I'll just do one here because I don't want the podcast to be too long here, but one of the best stories in the Bible that has to do with confrontation of the shadow is Jacob and Esau. And they're twins. And Jacob is a liar, a thief, an avoider, a mama's boy. He likes the tents, and he conspires with his mom to deceive his dad. And everything he has, he's kind of taken in a way. And we don't know if he can see it or not. I think the implication is he can't really see it. He just feels like it's rightfully mine. So he deceives Esau, takes the birthright, so forth and so on. And what's interesting is that he's then estranged from his brother for many, many years. And his father's dying, so he has to come back home. And that's the image of, okay, I've done my running. I've pushed everything down into the labyrinth, you could say, but now I can't hide anymore. The confrontation is here. And so just before he meets his brother the next day, he sends over all of his possessions and family across the river and stands there alone. So in other words, everything that has formed his identity, his ego consciousness, his persona, his castle, I am this, I am that, I have this many kids, my possessions, he sends it across the river, so he's essentially alone and naked. It doesn't say he's naked, but psychologically, spiritually, he's naked. And then it says in Hebrew, anashim, a man comes to wrestle with him. And I love the Bible because you can interpret it in a number of ways. The way I'm interpreting now is this is the Minotaur. This is the shadow. This is the part of his psyche that he has so resisted and pushed aside. And without this kind of wrestling match, which wounds him in the hip, he doesn't become a real man. He stays the deceiver. His name doesn't change from deceiver to one who wrestles with God, one who wrestles with what's ultimately true. And I think that's the invitation here. Okay? You can remain deceived, self-deceived, a deceiver the rest of your life. So a good midlife crisis is sending everything across the river and standing there and saying, okay, let's have it out. Let's wrestle it out. I want to look. I want to look. I don't want to remain blind the rest of my life. And it's going to hurt. And I'm going to walk with a limp. If all goes well, I will limp because of this. I will not be up on my high horse, righteous, pure, the knight in shining armor. I'm going to limp. You can see why none of us really want to walk toward that. Anyway, that's a little taste of the Jacob and Esau story in this respect. Okay, that feels like a good enough turning over the soil here of the shadow and the soul. A little map of the psyche, a little bit of projection, a little bit of how myth can help us. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for sharing this. I hope you do. Hope you pass it around. Thanks to my patrons for supporting me, for supporting this podcast. Makes a huge difference. Thanks for your patience. I know I've been a bit slow. I've had a lot of personal things going on in my life, which I've spoken a bit about, written to my patrons. So I really just appreciate you. And thanks for the back and forth I have sometimes with my patrons. They give me ideas, ask questions. So if you want to support this podcast, you can do so. Kent Dobson or patreon.com/Kent Dobson. If you want to come on my next retreat, you have to do it quickly. So sign up, go to my website. Love to have you. It'll be about an hour north of Grand Rapids in a place called Big Rapids, a place I've guided quite a few programs. So with Animist stuff, I have something called Soulcraft Journey. This is a 8-day backpacking trip in Utah. Really, really excited about that. Guiding with my friend Laura. I think we only have one spot left, so that's at Animus Valley Institute. And just in the last few days, we opened up the application process for the year-long. So if you're interested in a full year-long immersion in Animus work, in this great conversation of descent and return, going into the labyrinth and returning, metaphorically here, that's all that information can be found on the Animus Valley Institute website. But anyway, we're just taking applications for that, and that year-long program starts in November. So that's enough from me. Again, really appreciate you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you down the road.